Welcome everybody to our today's online talk. My name is Marianne Schörling. I'm head of stakeholder engagement at the Geneva Macro Labs, and I will moderate today's session alongside my colleague Renate Günther. Renate Günther, she is the vice president of Geneva Macro Labs and as well one of the founders of our Think and Do Tank. And today's session is quite a special one. We have the pleasure to be co-hosting today's event with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR. Therefore, I would like to warmly thank Philippe Aubert and Alena Blum from the Division for Multilateral Diplomacy from UNITAR. And I'm inviting Alena now to share a couple of words about UNITAR from your side. Over to you, Alena.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Marianne. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today, and also a very warm welcome on behalf of UNITAR today. Today's online talk, as Marianne mentioned, is co-organized by the Geneva Macro Labs and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and it's also the launch of the new partnership between UNITAR and the Geneva Macro Labs. Today's topic of diplomacy in cyberspace is quite an important and current issue that UNITAR has also really invested itself in throughout the last years. So we train individuals, organizations, and institutions on these topics, and almost all of our master programs also include modules on digital diplomacy. Apart from that, UNITAR focuses on providing training on other innovative aspects such as science diplomacy, leadership, intercultural communication, and other essential aspects of diplomacy in the 21st century. And so we're very glad to be able to share all this with you today, and very much looking forward to an interesting exchange and discussion. So thank you all very much for joining. And of course, thank you to Geneva Macro Labs for the excellent collaboration and cooperation. So yeah, without further ado, back to you, Marianne. Now we can get started.
Thank you, Alena, and the pleasure is ours. It's wonderful that we can start our partnership with you. So I'm extending as well our thanks to you and your whole team behind you. Thank you for that. So yeah, I would like to reiterate that global decision making is also on our agenda as we aspire to leverage the institutional, financial, and human capital around us here in Geneva. And at our Think and Do Tank, we co-develop solutions and publish respective papers. We address policy measures. We started, for instance, discussion paper series. We host quite a lot of conversations, especially since a year now, in form of online events, but as well conferences. We started with after-work gatherings and workshops. And something that I would like to highlight to all of you is that we recently started our Geneva Impact Initiative, where we call it a fast track for smart and actionable impact projects together with our growing community of leading minds. And for those of you who are tuning in today for the first time, I kindly invite you to have a look at our Geneva Impacts website, where you will learn more about the current impact projects that we are actually developing with different focus groups. And on another note, I would like to highlight that this Friday, so in 2 days from now, on March 5th at 6 p.m., we are gathering at our annual General Assembly, where we invite all members of our community to join. Please note, as a side note, that only those who contributed their membership fee will have the right to vote. These are just 2 little notes for the start. So what's happening today? Today we have 2 leading minds with us who will be talking about diplomacy in the cyberspace. And we use the title, The New Battleground of Geopolitics. We have the pleasure to welcome Shaun Riordan and Dejan Dinčić from the Diplo Foundation to share their insight. Professor Shaun Riordan, you are a member of the wider UNITAR community, and I'm sure we will benefit today a lot from your experience on the interface from cyberspace and diplomacy. A warm welcome to you. And Dejan, Dinčić, you are part of our Geneva Macro Labs community since quite a while now, and it's wonderful to have you today with us so that our audience can listen as well to your insights. Thank you both for joining us. We have chosen to talk with you about cyberspace as we see the need as well, like UNITAR, to address the potential but also the threats of interconnected digital technologies, which increased in both sophistication and number. And we can already see now here our agenda. We will first talk with Professor Shaun Riordan on the power dimensions and the main layers of cyberspace under the umbrella of geopolitics and digital technologies. He is the director of the chair for diplomacy and cyberspace at the European Institute of the International Studies. And then after Shaun, we will have Dejan, who will reflect on the diplomatic agenda and new actors in the cyberspace. Dejan is formerly technical director of Diplo Foundation, where he now teaches and provides strategic advice. On the setting, we have both speakers speaking for about 10 minutes, and then we will start, as usual, our Q&A session, for which we have planned about 30 minutes. Please note that our online talk is meant to be interactive, so as usual, you're invited to already comment and post the questions as we are actually speaking. Use please the chat box, and you're welcome to raise your voice during the Q&A, which will be moderated, as I've already mentioned, by Renate. So, Shaun, I think we can start. It's a pleasure having you with us today. A couple of words about your background. You're not only the director of the chair of diplomacy and cyberspace at the European Institute of International Studies, but also senior research fellow of the Johar Institute in Beijing, a former British diplomat and an author. You've published quite a number of books. For instance, the geopolitics of cyberspace, a diplomatic perspective, another one in 2019 on cyber diplomacy, managing security and governance online. And back in 2003, you've introduced the new diplomacy. So lots of books, and we're happy that you provided us with a couple of links that we can share with the audience tonight. A couple of PDFs so that we can have a greater look into that. Just want to highlight that one key argument that I really enjoyed as being myself a sociologist is that you argue foreign ministries and diplomatic services need to reform both their culture and structures to engage successfully with the challenges posed by cyberspace. And this is, in fact, I believe, not an easy task, as we're talking here about constructing new norms in a field where new actors gauge their strength and compete. And I would claim that we need an attentive diplomacy. But from your perspective, what are the major problems and hurdles for which we need holistic solutions when we talk about cyberspace? Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marianne. I'll just share the screen quickly. Where are we going from? Okay, my argument is that we need to start thinking about digital technologies and cyberspace as another area of problem for geopolitics, international relations, and for diplomats. And to a large extent, I think diplomats have been absent. They've come very late to new technologies. They've come very late to the problems of cyberspace. They've tended to think about it as being something created by technicians, therefore all problems are technical, therefore you can leave it to the techies. At the end of the First World War, the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau once said, "War is too important to leave to soldiers or to generals." I would argue that cyberspace is much too important to leave to techies or even intelligence officers, perhaps especially intelligence officers, who tend to spend their entire time spying on each other. Cyberspace just gives them a new area where they can go and have fun, but in dangerous ways for everyone else. So if we think about cyberspace, there are lots of definitions, but I think a good way to think about cyberspace, I think there are basically 4 layers of cyberspace. The physical layer, that's the layer that we forget, and I think Dejan's going to talk about it a little bit later, but the cables, the storage facilities, the switching stations, that's the physical underpinnings of cyberspace. Then we have the logical layer, which is the protocols, the addresses, the numbers. these are things that make sure that your email gets to the person you want it to go to, rather than their best friend, that you get to the web page that you want to get to. It's kind of the layer that makes sure the whole thing works. Then we have the data layer. The data layer is what it's all about. That's why we do it. We want to have the data out there. It's the contents of our emails. It's the content of the web pages that we want to search through. It's content of the social media platforms. And then finally, we have the social layer, which is us. Those of us here listening to this webinar today, those of us searching for searching out web pages, those of us communicating through various social media platforms or through email or other means. Now, until recently, I think the social layer has basically been humans, humans trying to engage with the internet. I think that's what turns the internet into cyberspace. It's the human involvement on a social level. But increasingly, we're seeing that social level is now devices, it's things. So when we get the Internet of Things, we're getting more and more devices sharing that place, sharing that social layer with us human beings. So it's changing its nature. And that we see, for example, in social media becomes very important, because do you know who you're talking to? Are you talking to a human being? Are you talking to a bot? Are you talking to some other program? That raises some real challenges for us. Now, I would argue that the problems at all four levels are not technical. The technical problems with digital technologies have basically been solved. What we're talking about now are the problems of human beings. We're talking about political and geopolitical problems. So to give one example at each layer, at the physical layer, it's interesting, the first thing that the British did at the beginning of the First World War, the first act of violence carried out by the British government at the beginning of the First World War was to cut the German telegraph cable to America. So that German communications during the First World War had to go on British cables. And of course, the British listened. Don't believe all that nonsense you hear about us being gentlemen. We're not. We were listening ruthlessly. Well, now, if you go off the southwest of England, you'll find that the internet cables also go through the same place. I think Dejan's possibly got a lovely map to show us of that. And at the moment, we have British and we have Russian submarines dancing around there. Not quite sure what the Russians are trying to do, but the British are trying to make sure they're not going to do it anyway. That's a very geopolitical layer. How much of that physical layer do you need to destroy to bring down the internet? At a logical layer, much of the internet governance is done by ECAN. ECAN is a non-for-profit private company in California under California state law that decides who gets which addresses and numbers in the internet. Who gets, for example, .amazon? Does it go to a well-known online retailer, or does it go to the people living in the Amazon basin? That's not decided by an international organization. It's decided by a private company under California law. Is that acceptable? That's a political decision. It's not technical. Data protection, privacy laws, unacceptable content. We'll talk a little bit about cyber in a minute, cyber crime and cyber security in a minute. These are all political and geopolitical problems. That's the level. That's where the real problems are. So we need diplomats engaging with this, not with techies. As within one of the problems with science diplomacy, where we need to distinguish between the diplomacy and the science. The problems in science diplomacy are essentially diplomatic. Problems in cyber diplomacy are also diplomatic, and you need diplomats for dealing with them. And this is true also about cybersecurity. If we think that most cyber penetrations, most penetrations of people's computer systems or internet systems, etc., they're basically sociological rather than technical. Use technical penetrations for really high value targets, because zero-day exploits are very expensive to buy. You need a lot of technical expertise to be able to use them. It's so much easier cracking someone's password. It's so much easier spear phishing and persuading somebody to open an email attachment that they shouldn't open. And we're all guilty. The favorite password in the United States of America is password. This is followed rapidly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for the real sophisticates, by 54321. And before we all get cocky, we all put combinations of boyfriends, girlfriends, wives, husbands, children's, favorite uncles, names and birthdays online as our passwords. And then we upload the information onto Facebook so that any hacker can find it fairly easily. We're not good at the sociology of cybersecurity. If I send you all an email on Friday afternoon appearing to come from your boss saying that I've been thinking about your future in the company or future in the organization, I put some thoughts down on paper, how you can play a bigger role, I'm attaching it, could you have a look at it over the weekend? Provided it looks like an email from your boss, we will all open it. And as soon as you've opened it, the malware is in the system. I'm working my way through the organization's files. That is where we have the major problems in cybersecurity, and these are about cyber hygiene. They're about human behavior, human understanding. It's not so much technical. When we get to the major cybersecurity issues, we've got issues like attribution. How do we know who did it? Technical forensic techniques will take us so far, but we still need to understand why people might be doing things, what their intentions are. How do we deter people from doing things? How do we respond to cyber attacks? If we're responding to cyber attacks, do we only respond in cyberspace, or can we respond to cyber attacks in physical space? If you hack my computers and you do enough damage, can I launch a missile at you? NATO doctrine says yes. Others say no. These are all highly political issues that need, or highly geopolitical issues that need to be decided at the geopolitical level, not at a technical level. What does neutrality mean, for example? So these are not technical fixes. We need diplomatic management of cyber problems. And part of this is deciding what kind of norms we can develop in cyberspace. To what extent does international law apply in cyberspace? Does it make sense to say that international law applies in cyberspace? There's a massive area of discussion, and one of the big areas of discussion, for example, does the UN Charter apply in cyberspace? Well, the main thing of the UN Charter is Article 51 about self-defense and Chapter 7 about international peace and security, whereby the Security Council can authorize military action or sanctions against countries that are felt to have misbehaved. Problem with cyberspace is we do not have an agreed definition of what an armed attack is, and we don't understand what international peace and security in cyberspace could conceivably mean. So how can we say the UN Charter applies to cyberspace? These are all issues that we need to be debating at the diplomatical level. And perhaps the final thing I'd like to point out is that weapons of mass destruction, the risk of escalating to nuclear war or to other levels of mass destruction have meant that physical conflict is not terribly attractive for major powers carrying out interstate warfare. If we talk about the rivalry, for example, between China and the US, they're not that keen to get into nuclear war with each other. And they know that once they start firing off missiles at each other, you're always risking that escalation. So you start looking for other areas where you can compete, where you can have rivalry. And one that they've chosen, or one that's been picked on at the moment, is technology. Who dominates new technologies? Who sets the rules for new technologies? An example of this is the debate about Huawei and 5G. Western governments are expressing concerns about the security aspect. If we allow Huawei to build our 5G networks, does that mean that all the information on our 5G networks is going to end up in Beijing or Shanghai, probably more likely? I actually think there's a bigger debate here, and that is about who sets the international industrial standards for new technologies. Until recently, the new industrial standards for mobile technologies, the advanced communications technologies, have been set by American companies or by companies in allies of America. For the first time with 5G, we're seeing the industrial standards being set by a Chinese company, by the company of a rival of the US. And that, I think, is a much more important issue than whether we can trust the infrastructure that Huawei might put in our 5G, not least because actually Huawei make up a lot of the 4G, 3G infrastructure that we already have. This is a great battleground. And this is a battleground that's going to continue because while we're arguing about 5G, China is developing 6G. Please don't ask me what 6G is. I have no idea. I don't actually understand what 5G does, to be perfectly honest, but I'm told it's really cool and you can watch films while you're walking in the countryside. So I look forward to that. Not. But we're going to have the same fight about 6G. Who's going to set the industrial standards? And the danger of that for the future is that we start fragmenting our technologies. I'm old enough to remember something called DVDs. Perhaps some of our participants can also remember DVDs. For those of you too young, like Elena there, they're things that you used to watch films on, and a bit like CDs. We thought they were wonderful when they came out. Now you just stream off Netflix. But DVDs were regional. If you bought your DVD in the wrong region, you couldn't use it on your DVD player. In other words, we have fragmented technologies. I think one of the great risks we've got going forward, if we don't manage the technology conflicts well, we're going to end up with fragmentation of our technology and the consequent negative impact on economy and on our way of life. We need diplomats. And with that, I'll pass over to Dejan, who'll tell us what the diplomats are doing.
Thank you, Shaun. That was wonderful, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. A great outline, and in particular, liked how you structured your analysis into the 4 layers of cyberspace, stating that the problems are not technical but human. I think that's a strong statement, and will lead to some discussion. And understanding internet governance by looking at their physical, logical data and social layer seems to me like a very pragmatic approach, and yeah, all 4 are part of the equation for preparing for a sustainable future, where we need to look into new battlefields where we have unequal power distribution. So we might discuss this later in the Q&A. So yeah, I would like to give the floor now to Dejan Dincic. Dejan, you are a digital transformation and online learning specialist, and apart from working with the Diplo Foundation, you're also serving the UN Joint Inspection Unit in Geneva, where you lecture on digital topics and provide strategic advice to international organizations and NGOs. And you have more than 20 years of experience in the private, public and non-profit sectors in academia. And on the final note, you have been quite an active member in our community. So looking into your background and expertise, it seems to me very impressive how technology and digitization are profoundly impacting all aspects of our society, including decision making. Now, given that standards, as we just have heard, of behavior in the cyberspace remain unclear, and some of them are defined in international law, while new actors enter the scene, how would you actually say that diplomacy is developing in the cyberspace? What actually does diplomacy entail when we talk about the cyberspace? Over to you.
Thank you, Marianne. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and especially to share the virtual floor with Shaun. We were lucky. I think you could have spent days reading about key materials and or listen to 10 minutes essential excellent summary by Shaun. So I think we are lucky with that. On my side, I will try to illustrate a few of the points, the practical side you're asking. So how, what are the more practical implications? But I'll do it in a way of like peeling the onion layers, maybe, rather than through a very short summary. Let's see if I manage. To start with, I couldn't agree more with Shaun. Although one of my backgrounds is in technology, I couldn't agree more that it's really the big issues that we are facing today are not technical, and that we actually need engagement of other policymakers. And I know, especially, I mean, lots of my colleagues have a very technical approach, but I completely agree with Shaun. And to begin with, just a quick look at this slide with different prefixes shows a bit how much we've been wondering over the last couple of decades in terminology, which reflects 2 things, I think. On one side, yes, some of these prefixes reflect particular aspects of digital diplomacy. We often use cyber when we want to refer to security or geopolitical aspects of of the digital sphere. The other also reflect the fact that this topic, this whole area, which is constantly growing, is also evolving, and they reflect, on one side, somewhat naive and late arrival of diplomats into this area, and then gradual understanding that things are complex and we need to engage. So I think they also reflect the evolution of the digital diplomacy. I would say that the term digital diplomacy is probably today most comprehensive, although it has very strong international cooperation and developmental connotation as well, but it's probably the one that today reflects global understanding of the topics. And I switch to, when you ask what happens, what does it entail? Well, first we have a list of new topics on the agenda, and these topics are, I started here with just some of the topics which have a clear digital focus. So from internet governance over net neutrality and data sovereignty and fake news and filter bubbles and so on. So all these topics are new for diplomats, relatively new. And most of them didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago at all, or if they existed, they were the domain of technical communities and engineers, not of diplomats. But apart from the new topics with clear digital focus, we also have more traditional diplomatic topics that are now completely mixed with the digital aspect of it. So even when you're discussing trade or health or any other or development, you also have to deal with very strong digital component, and that's one aspect. Among those digital topics, so while some of them have digital focus, but they also reflect, internet was started as an open architecture, and it's still to a large extent open, and that's what has contributed to its success, this open architecture. But the recent trends are actually moving us into a slightly different perspective on the internet and the cyberspace, and I list a couple of topics here that we can label as digital policy or realpolitik, as states try to ascertain their hold on this once virtual and unregulated space. So it also means this is what digital diplomacy also means today. There are a number of multilateral processes that deal with digital. So these are specialized processes. You may remember World Summit of Information Society, which started in Geneva in 2003, and WSIS Forum is still going on today. You have probably most inclusive and broadest process, Internet Governance Forum, which is strong after a number of years and receives further support from UN, and a recent UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation, which also resulted in a roadmap that we now have as at the UN level as one of the things, which also tries to, okay, this is cyberspace, this is digital world, what does it also mean for SDGs? These are important issues. Clearly, there is potential, but some of the processes are focusing on the security aspects, and the two listed here, two parallel processes, the UN Group of Government Experts and open-ended working group, are working on the security aspects and on the responsible behavior of states in cyberspace. But in addition to that, you also have a number of traditional processes. So, World Trade Organization in Geneva continues to negotiate rules on e-commerce, and International Labour Organization explore the future of work in the context of emerging technologies, platforms, machine learning, etc. A lot of these discussions, for us in Geneva, this is also an important fact, that a lot of these discussions, maybe very rough estimate, maybe 50% of them happen in Geneva, a multilateral fora. A very good place and to follow these policy processes is Digital Watch. I will post a link to it later, an observatory by Geneva Internet Platform. So apart from new topics, we also have new actors. I put here this picture of Kasper Klinge, He was the first person to be officially appointed ambassador to Silicon Valley or to the technology sector by Denmark back in 2017, which reflects two things: that the late understanding of the rising importance and power of big tech companies by states, and it reflects also still a sentiment of techno optimism that was still present. It was already, a time was changing, but there was still a bit of techno optimism and less suspicion at that time. As Shaun pointed out the other day, as Kasper is since March last year employed by Microsoft, he's vice president for European government affairs. States have difficult time keeping good talent when it comes to competition with big tech companies. So the new actors are these big tech companies. They are among others, and we have seen this in recent news. You have seen probably negotiations around the new law in Australia that's trying to make the revenue sharing between big platforms and the news sector and somehow protect the public role of journalism, and the controversies that went around it. And you had a situation where at one stage Facebook said, well, we'll withdraw all the Australian news from our platform. So these big tech companies have not only economic power, but they also have other ways to influence and to negotiate. And this was not the first case of state negotiating with companies, tech companies. In 2017, Indonesia published that they reached an agreement with Google about their taxes in Indonesia. It's just one of a number of states. And similar events, we also have the trend of localizing data in particular jurisdictions. And we have, of course, European Union's GDPR, which has been quite successful and has served as a model. So General Data Protection Rule, which was created to provide some protection for data of citizens. But those things happen in a space in which you have new actors and you have many somewhat different dynamics. Shaun mentioned, I like this slide. So it's an oldish map. There you can find newer maps on internet that try to reflect internet traffic. But I like this one because it visually it's good. It also reflects the mass of traffic along certain corridors. So we like to think about our data being in the cloud, but our data is actually mostly underwater. These submarine cables that have played strategic role in international relations, as Shaun said, from the end of 19th century and the early 20th century and later, now also carry the huge bulk of our internet traffic. So the data, so there is a physical reality, the layer in the layers that Shaun described. This is the physical layer and still plays an important role. Data also has to be stored on servers, which have physical locations, and they are under certain jurisdictions, and there is certain dynamics around that, where data centers will be and who will have a jurisdiction over them. So, and even in this sphere, we have a growing importance of big tech companies. So a large portion of submarine cables today is owned by a smaller number of large and leading tech companies. Google is not the only one. They are the leaders, but Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook also have significant portions of submarine cables. In the past, these used to be often state-led consortia, groups of private companies that created these connections, but now the structure, the ownership structure and control over these is changing. How am I doing with time? Okay, so just a maybe brief takeaway. Key issues are not technical. I completely agree with Shaun. There are new topics, new actors, but also traditional, diplomatic activities have been transformed. And to avoid the fragmentation that Shaun pointed out, we really need states to work in a more cooperative way. We need digital cooperation and collaboration rather than more investment into building one's cyber offensive capacities. I know it's a slightly utopian view, but I hope that this approach will prevail. And yeah, if you want to follow these news more, you can use Digital Watch. The URL is below. It's an observatory. And with that, I think we'll leave anything else for the question time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dejan. And it's nice because you have actually laid the red carpet for the discussion, I think, because looking at the chat, there has been some interaction actually, in particular to that fragmentation as well, how international collaboration can actually look like, taking into account that we have the different power dimensions, we have not equal power distribution. So I'm handing over now to Renate to guide us through the Q&A session. I encourage all of you to still continue posting your comments and your questions into the chat, as we want to engage as well in that space.
Very good.
Renate.
Thank you. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you for your questions. And I already identified quite some interesting ones. And I want to ask Mark and Marie Wartenberg to unmute your microphones and to ask your questions, because you have quite similar ones. So Mark, would you like to go first, and then Marie?
Yeah, this is Mark Liberati. I was asking about the emergence of this the UN digital blue helmets, which had been announced, and there hasn't been much more information forthcoming as to what the international community is considering and looking at applying the current peace and security architecture and sort of up through the lens of cyberspace. It was also then in that same vein looking at solutions that might be emerging out, because I think it was mentioned the Outer Space Treaty, but also looking at what entities might be considering for public cyber infrastructure, so that you could have a peaceful place, especially as we're going to sort of space-based 6G, 5G networks, and looking at what is the role of international institutions such as the UN to facilitate or even administer this public infrastructure for peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Marie, I don't know, are you? Ah, wonderful. So would you like to go also next with your question?
Yes, thank you so much for your question, Mark. That might be also part of the answer to one of my questions. So I was just thinking that, you know, we can notice a shift from the actors of like international conflicts away from states, and we see more and more non-state actors involved nowadays. So I was just wondering, how does cyber warfare or cyberspace here maybe enables non-state actors even more, and what are the ways to tackle these non-state actors?
Thank you, Marie. Yeah, Dejan, Shaun, please feel free to answer the questions.
Perhaps picking up on Marie's point about non-state actors, I mean, first of all, there is no doubt that the internet and digital technologies have greatly enhanced the capability of non-state actors to participate in international affairs, to take part in international debates, for good and for ill. And we need to remember that every time they enhance capacities of a Bellingcat or an Amnesty International, they also enhance capabilities of an Islamic State or an Al-Qaeda. So we have to deal with both sides of it. I think in terms of cybersecurity, the main actors remain states. If we think about the kinds of cyber offensive operations we have seen, we've only seen one operation where a cyber attack resulted in permanent physical damage. what we call a degradation attack. We've only got one example of that, and that's Stuxnet. And that was the attack against the Iranian nuclear processing plant at Natanz, carried out pretty much certainly by the US and by Israel. And that was an attack of enormous sophistication, which required enormous technical capability and enormous financial background. So I don't think we're going to see non-state act. The idea, the image of the, the spotty kid with a hoodie in his bedroom carrying out major cyber attacks is hopelessly out of date. Even with cyber crime, we're looking at organized groups carrying out organized crime. That said, what we do see is states using proxies. And that becomes one of the major problems. It becomes a problem in terms of attribution. It becomes a problem in risks of escalation. But there are a number of states that, rather than carrying out their own cyber operations, are using proxies. And I think that does cause problems for us. If I can go on very quickly onto the UN, and then I'll pass it over to Dejan, because he knows much more about it than I do. I'm very skeptical about the ability of the UN to achieve anything in this as in anything else. And Elena's going to be horrified with me saying this, but the UN does not do much in international peace and security because it can only do what the member states agree. And if the member states don't agree, then the UN can't do anything. And the same is true about cyber. And if you look at the constitution of the Security Council, there are 5 permanent members who have the right to veto anything on the Security Council, and they are all major cyber offense countries. They're all countries carrying out offensive cyber operations, and none of them are going to agree to give up their offensive capability in the interest of international peace and security. So I think we need to find other routes, other ways of doing it, and perhaps we can come back to that later in the Q&A.
So Dejan, would you also like to add something?
I don't have much to add. I think Shaun described it well. On the UN blue helmets, I think it's, from what I know, that was meant to be an internal protection force. So it's more to act defensively in the UN sphere, not just within the agencies, but also including protecting the programs of UN agencies out there in the field. But I'm not aware of it having UN having an external looking cyber defensive programs. So at least to my knowledge, that's all I wanted to say, which is a more limited role for, but yes, UN is, there are a few developments within the UN on improving its own internal cyber defenses, but it's difficult. And one of the reasons, I mean, very well described by Shaun.
Thank you, Dejan. Sorry, thank you, Dejan. I want to give the floor to Patrick Flynn, who has a question, and then over to Sandro, also had a couple of questions if you want to go next. Patrick, please. Are there technical problems?
Yeah, if Sandra goes first, I'll need to fix something.
Mm-hmm.
No worries. Hi guys. So for me, this is a rather complex issue and topic, because first of all, you're talking about a multi-level platform that's already subjected to several laws. So it's for me, it's impossible to talk about diplomacy in cyberspace without talking about the legal aspect of it, the monopoly aspect of it, and the local aspects of it. So what is it that we really want to achieve here? Why do we want to have diplomats in cyberspace? What are these people supposed to do? Are they supposed to, control, advise, keep the peace? It's like, talking about a telephone line. Do we need diplomats for a telephone line? I mean, for me, cyberspace is just another way of communicating. And right now it's being used by a lot of companies, politicians, extremists. And I think the laws are already there to actually manage this, but we just don't apply it on cyberspace because it's too international. And I'm just trying to find out how do you see this diplomacy working? What should they do?
So who wants to answer this question? Shaun, Dejan? Who wants to go
I'm at
first?
some danger here of having a conflict of interest, being an ex-diplomat. So perhaps I should declare that first. I think in many ways, what you're looking for diplomats to do in cyberspace is what they do in physical space. And one of the problems, I think, Sandra, is that cyberspace is not just about communication, it's about miscommunication.
Sure.
It's about carrying out operations to cause damage, to steal information. There's a whole range of things that we're doing in cyberspace that go beyond just communication. And one of the problems that we have in cyberspace, as we have in physical space, and this is just to give you an example of what diplomats should be doing, is understanding the intentions and motivations of different actors, why people are doing things. So if I give you an example, a simple example, if somebody carries out a penetration of a foreign computer system, it's very difficult to tell from the penetration itself, simply from the coding, whether we're talking about an operation to steal information, an operation to assess capabilities and intentions, or an operation preparing for a future cyber attack if conflict were to arise between these countries. According to how you interpret what somebody's done, what somebody's doing, according to how you interpret their motivations, then you're going to decide your response. Are you going to respond very firmly? Are you going to respond in a more flexible way? And that is something that we need. That is something diplomats do as their profession. Diplomats serving abroad assess the intentions and motivations of the countries that they are in, and should be, if they're doing their job, in a position to advise their governments about what's being done and how to react to it. So that is one of the things that diplomats should be doing. I think the other thing that diplomats should be doing is we don't have any rules in cyberspace. We don't have any laws that apply internationally in cyberspace. And we need to get some kind of order, just as we do in physical space. International law does not function in the way that domestic law does. International law functions very much because countries want to be seen to obeying international law. International law functions in as far as it codifies existing norms and practice established by, among others, diplomats, soldiers, businessmen, political leaders, statesmen. In cyberspace, we need to start thinking about same things. And cyberspace is very different from physical space. For example, there's no point to talk about arms control, because how do you control code? It's very difficult to distinguish code. But you can have talks about limiting targets. Do we limit the targets of cyber attacks? Are there certain kinds of targets that we can agree at an international level are not acceptable? So I think there are plenty of things to be done by diplomats in cyberspace. Very much the kind of things that they do in physical space, but in a newer area of operation.
I think that's really good, Shaun, and I hear your answer. But don't you think that cyberspace is so big that you need to focus first on one specific point? Because you cannot tackle the whole cyberspace at once.
I
talking about.
By the way, I would agree with you. It's not just diplomats. One of the things that diplomats have got to learn in the new world in general, but particularly in cyberspace, is talking to non-diplomats. And I noticed that in the chat, you were talking about the role of internet companies.
Yes.
I think we've got a real problem with internet companies, partly because in Europe we don't have any. Mm-hmm. They tend to come from only two countries, from the US and from China.
Correct.
And we find ourselves squeezed between them. Partly because they basically are international actors, geopolitical actors in their own right. If we look at someone like Facebook, it's even talking about issuing its own currency, its own digital. You cannot get more geopolitical than issuing your own currency as a challenge to the dollar as global reserve currency. I don't think it'll work, but that is an aspiration. So I think we do need to engage with the big companies and with all the other users. constructing norms in cyberspace is going to be a joint activity by lots of different kinds of actors working together. But you're absolutely right. Let's start with small things. Let's start with things like protecting critical civilian infrastructure. I think that'd be a great place to start.
Thank you, Shaun.
Thank you. So, Michele, may I ask you to ask your question, and then Jan, please also go directly after Michele.
If I'm not mistaken, Patrick wanted to share something as well, right?
Patrick said he's fine. He doesn't want to share anymore.
No, sorry, I meant I'm good to ask now. If that's okay.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Sorry, Shaun.
Patrick, you're muted.
Sorry, Shaun, thanks very much. It's a really interesting discussion. I think you opened up your statement with that the English were listening to German telegrams to the US, and I think that's very interesting. And I think the US now objecting to Huawei 5G equipment is all but admitting that they use, internet to do intelligence gathering, and I think it's probably a key part of the discussion is to get to the bottom of how these, like you said, 5 key stakeholders in the UN Council that have a veto, getting to the bottom of how important this aspect of intelligence gathering is on the internet for these strongest players is probably needs to be discussed widely, so that diplomacy can really take, can really begin it in cybersecurity.
Can I very quickly come back on that? I think we need to understand that this has always been a problem, that the big powers have always been spying, and the big powers have always had an espionage capability much greater than anyone else. And that was true before the internet. If we think about the ability to listen to international communications, to listen to people's diplomatic traffic, that's always been going on. I think where the difference is now the capacity to listen to ordinary citizens and the surveillance that comes of ordinary citizens. And I think that is a massive change. And that's something that we need to think about in our own societies. We know from Snowden that the Americans do have agreements with their companies to get data from them. So that's probably why they don't trust Huawei, because they know what Google and Microsoft already do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shaun. Michele, would you like to go next?
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you both speakers for excellent discussion, amazing topics to me. This talk triggered to me one thing. Recently, about let's say 2 years ago or something, there was a couple of strange collision about Navy vessels from US and some fishing vessel or other passenger vessel around China and Korea area. I don't know if you are familiar or if you remember. There was a couple of short news in the news. However, we didn't have any other information. There was a totally unexpected how possible as US carry, for instance, collapse with a fishing vessel. So it was probably something related to the topic we are discussing that bring to my mind. So I simply would like to have your opinion on the topic in this event, if you are familiar with. Thank you very much.
I don't know if Dejan knows about. I don't know about this particular case. Perhaps Dejan can comment.
Okay.
No, I'm afraid I'm also not familiar with this. I don't remember this incident.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
So we have 5 minutes left. Should we take a last question from Jan and then hand over back to Marianne? What should we? How are we in time-wise?
Renate, I would suggest we take one more question and then
then Jan, please go.
Thank you, Renate and Marianne. Thank you for your speakers for the excellent presentations. I've got one issue regarding education, and I think education is a key for diplomats, and diplomats are needed in this space because, well, telephone wouldn't have worked without diplomats agreeing on how the telephone network could work internationally. So we need this education. I'm teaching at the Geneva School of Diplomacy, and I see that the Diplo Foundation is also doing a great job. But I get the impression that technology is advancing faster than we can educate. Do you think we need to do more for education? And if you think yes, what should we do?
Well, I agree with you, Jan. This is also what I do formally in structured training programs, but also informally in some of my projects. I often play a mediator role between policy makers or decision makers and the technology world. So I agree with you. What I think we need is also to understand. So what I've noticed also is that often training is too technical. What I think decision makers need a kind of training where they can understand social and economic and political implications of emerging technologies. That's what they need more than some of the training that is often offered to them, which doesn't really bring enough attention to those aspects, but makes them dive into technical world, and then they don't feel. It's just, so I think we need to change to better understand the needs for education, and yes, we need more training. I don't know how we can institute that on a larger scale, but I absolutely agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dejan. So I'm handing back to Marianne now for the last comments.
Thank you, Renate, and also thank you to you, Dejan and Shaun. It was very interesting to listen to your insight, in particular how we can go about this different power distributions and the battlefield where we have so many new actors entering. What I would like you to do now, as we're finishing, would you share with us, with the audience, one final statement that you find corresponds well to our discussion tonight? Shaun, may you want to go first? So let me just unmute you.
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Here we go.
I got warned I had to tell a funny story about diplomacy, so I'm going to combine the funny story about diplomacy with the lesson. When I was diplomat serving in China in the early 1990s, I was traveling in the northwest, and we stopped in a village in Sichuan for lunch. And it was a very small village, and we went to a little shack for lunch and had wonderful food, because we always have wonderful food in Sichuan. And after lunch, I asked where the bathroom was, and I was pointed to a shack in the middle of a field. And being a British diplomat, always well prepared, I got my toilet roll out of my bag. And I marched into the middle of the field. And when I went into the shack, it was what I expected. A hole in the ground, 2 planks on which you placed your feet, and you didn't inquire about what was in the hole. So I knew what to do. I stood on the 2 planks. I was busy doing my diplomatic business when the door of the shack opened and the head of a bull suddenly came into the shack. I hadn't noticed there was a bull in the field. And fortunately, only the head came in, because if any more of the bull had come in, I would have ended up in the hole with the diplomatic business, which is not where I wanted to end up. And I had to work out what to do. And I tried to remember what diplomatic procedure said about this, because we always got a little book when we joined the Foreign Office about British diplomatic procedure. And I couldn't remember the page about how to deal with a bull in the toilet in China. I obviously not studied that one carefully enough. And so I did what any diplomat does when you're confronted by a situation you've never met before. Mastery in activity. I did nothing. I stared as calmly as I could at the bull, and I waited for it to go away. And eventually it did go away. And I emerged from the shack, and I returned to my Chinese hosts with as much dignity as I could manage. They, of course, were all laughing hysterically, because they had seen the bull in the field before they sent me to this shack. And they thought it was very, very funny to let a British diplomat do this. Why do I say this? Well, certain lessons. First of all, diplomats must be ready to deal with new situations. And I think we can see cyberspace as being the equivalent of a bull sticking its head in a toilet in China. It's certainly shocking and difficult to deal with. But we must remember the basics of diplomacy, in this case, mastery in activity. We're still doing diplomacy, even if it's in a new field. I think perhaps a third lesson, the Chinese always get the last laugh. I'll stop there.
That was good. I think we need to continue our discussion after we are finishing our talk tonight. Dejan, over to you.
To be honest, while listening to Shaun, I forgot my takeaway lesson. But I think one is, let's try and avoid fragmentation of the internet. I think in everyone's interest. Somebody mentioned, telephone networks to operate globally. We needed international telecoms union, and diplomats play a role when they come together. Member states coming together can do enabling things, not necessarily just harming things. And the other is, let us also keep thinking always when we are facing an apparent complexity of emerging technologies, let us always try to think about the social, political, and economic implications of these technologies. Let's keep that in mind. Let's start with that when dealing with new projects.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you all of you who have been contributing tonight and listening to our online talks. We would love to stay in touch with you, receiving your feedback and comments via a channel of your convenience. You can reach us through LinkedIn, Twitter, email, YouTube, and our website. Please share with us what you were thinking about our tonight's exchange. And we will be back, in fact, in 2 weeks, where we will be talking about ESG of business, environmental social governance evaluation. And also as a final note, if you like what we are doing and you would love to be more involved in exchanging with our community, contributing to our Think and Do tank, we invite you to consider becoming a member. Also, a big thank you to UNITAR, and we're happy that we are starting our collaboration, our partnership with you. Yeah, and as a final note, the financial contributions of our partners and members, they allow us to serve you with events like tonight once. We love to provide you with a platform of a growing community of leading minds and opportunities to jumpstart together new initiatives. So we don't want to stop here. So please reach out. And yeah, so in the name of UNITAR and the Geneva Labs, I'm closing our tonight's session. I wish you, in the name of the whole team, now an excellent rest of the day, and we are looking forward to hearing back from you. Thank you, a bientôt, and stay well.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.